Chris, welcome to the Decision Making Studio podcast. This is a pleasure. I welcome you. I think this is going to be a fabulous conversation, and it's a pleasure to be here talking to you.
So nice to meet you. Hi, dear listener. Really looking forward to this. I've been listening to a few decision-making podcasts, and I think this is absolutely fantastic material. Everybody needs this stuff.
Thank you. Thanks, Chris. Look, we're going to get into some really useful stuff around the way Charles and his wife, Emma, made decisions. And I was just heartened when I saw your stuff because it clearly, Charles Darwin was well ahead of his time. But also some of what we will talk about is probably very familiar to some of my listeners. And so that is kind of reassuring in a variety of ways. Before we do that, though, I think it would be useful to dive into your background a little bit and just to understand who you are and then how you got so interested in the work of your great-great-grandfather.
Yeah, thanks, Ben. So initially, my parents, lovely people, but they overdid the Darwin thing with me. And I really did react negatively to the point at which in my 20s, I if you mentioned Charles Darwin, I would have just stifled a yawn. And then I went into advertising and then went into becoming a canyoning and climbing instructor in the Blue Mountains. I did that for 30 years. And one day, my boss said, if I got the job for you, and I said, what are we going to do? And he said, I want you to take a group of people down the Charles Darwin walk in the Blue Mountains in Australia. So I live in Australia. And I said, I know nothing about Charles Darwin, Glenn. Please don't give me this. You can do it. You seem to be really excited about this. And he said, no, go and read a book and pull your act together. Learn about your ancestor. And so I did. And one thing that led to the other. And so that I became much more interested in Charles Darwin and as a result of having to learn it.
And what got you interested in the way in which Charles Darwin made decisions? What was it that led you there?
Yeah, thanks. Look, I think that initially I just learned a few dates and facts about Charles Darwin and gave those on the walk. And then I started reading his autobiography. I started giving lectures on him because there were people who were saying, do you want to give a lecture on Charles Darwin? And I said, okay, why not? And then I just started discovering this incredible decision-making process that he and Emma, his wife, had. And I started using it myself. And I was going, wow, this is just fantastic. Because, of course, dear listener, you are actually relatively educated, probably in comparison to the average person. But isn't it amazing that we're never taught how to make decisions? And yet it's probably the single greatest determinant of whether you have a good or a bad life is the quality of the 35,000 decisions you make a day. And yet we're never taught to do it. So I started using some of these sort of systems that Charles suggested. And I just realized that my life was improving as a result of it.
Yes, we don't get taught how to make good decisions. It's so interesting. And interesting from a variety of perspectives. I'd like to put this into a little bit of historical perspective because obviously Charles Darwin absolutely smashed the paradigms of the time in which he lived. And one of the things that we desperately, I think, need to address is this very topic of helping people and organizations get better at recognizing when they're making good or bad decisions and get better at making good decisions. There's something about the way in which we're educated that just completely papers this over, and almost to the extent where it seems like it's assumed we know how to do this well because it's an innate human thing, right? Well, I can't really think of any better person to think, to consider when talking about what is innate and what is something that we can learn. But I'm just curious about how you look at it from the point of view of, well, Charles Darwin clearly shook up quite a few people in his time, and I think we need to perhaps do the same. I'm just wondering if we could place some of this into some historical context, which I'm sure you have some views around.
Yeah. So yes, I mean, the world is obviously moving a lot faster today than it was in Charles's days. So in many ways, we need better decision making today. And what has become a prevalent way around decision making is that if a bad decision is made, everybody makes a huge effort to hide it, when in fact it is the greatest learning opportunity. People tend not to change when things are going well. People change a lot when things are going badly. So it's a huge learning opportunity. The historical context of Charles, I should imagine a lot of dear listeners you probably know, but basically in Charles's day, everybody believed the universe was 4,000 years old. This is in the Christian world, 4,000 years old. It had been created in 6 days. The God had made every animal and plant in their present modern form, and they were what's called immutable. They could not change. And in God's greatest moment of blissful creation, he created man in his image. And so you can imagine how everybody felt like they'd been demoted when suddenly this guy Charles Darwin comes along and says, "No, we're just monkeys. That's all we are." And everybody, what? I thought I was made in the image of a god, and now I'm being demoted to a monkey. So I'm sure we're going to come to this, but all sorts of innate psychological things happen when one of your core paradigms is challenged. And I'm sure your listeners, well, maybe they don't, but I wouldn't surprise me if they know about the suppression of the unthinkable. Is that when one of your core paradigms is being challenged, something called the suppression of the unthinkable jumps up and puts up a barrier in between you and that new idea. And I'm going to try and actually in this podcast try and get you to feel it a bit, because it is important. But yes, I mean, Charles was radical.
Yeah. Well, let's get into it perhaps a bit more. And it might be good to start with just what is this framework that Charles Darwin possessed or used. I presume you've kind of pieced it together through your work. I doubt that, maybe you could correct me, but that he actually sort of wrote down and said, this is my framework and for future generations. And but it'd be useful to just talk a little bit about it, what's involved, and then we can maybe dive into some of the elements.
Yeah, if only Charles had written the 7 habits of highly effective people or the 7 habits of a biologist. He didn't. He wrote it in his autobiography, which is actually free on Kindle, dear listener. You can get it free off Amazon on Kindle. He doesn't do a sort of, classic, here are my 6 points and this is how you do them. Although some of it's very, very direct. I mean, the golden rule, which is number 5, is very, very direct. But let's just quickly just give an overview of them. I'll just whistle through all of them. Let's just go through.
Yes.
So number 1 is data, not feelings. Mm-hmm. I should imagine a lot of people think, oh, look, I don't use feelings, but actually you do. You use feelings for a lot of decisions. And Charles used feelings, but he said data, not feelings. Number 2 is have a think once you've got the data, how you're going to process the data. Most people use intuitive thinking for 100% of their decision-making process. Charles would love, dear listener, to give you deductive and inductive, and we will run through that. The next skill that he is keen to offer you is the use of options. It's very easy to get stuck on an idea. I'm absolutely convinced that this is the right idea for me. and then you find the data to support that idea.
Mm-hmm.
And before you know it, you've absolutely gone down.
Mm-hmm.
Charles loved going, well, let's just have a think about it. What could it be? If it's not this, then what could it be? And traditionally, well, not traditionally, but he liked 4 options. The next one after that is
I just wanted to stop you. I just want to stop you there. He liked 4 options. Now I'm feeling nice and warm here because in my decision making training that I offer and give to people, I talk about options and I say have somewhere around 3 to 6 options, good options when you're making a decision. So it's right in that sweet spot. So I'm like, anyway, we want to have data, not just feelings. So anyway, let's crack on.
Yeah. And you're right, because two options is incredibly easy. Option one is the status quo. Option 2 is your pet idea of the new change.
Yes.
You've got 2 options. You're off the races.
Yeah.
3 options, maybe just a variation of your pet idea. But once you go to 4 or 5 or 6 or 7, you're having to work a bit. You're having to pause the whole process of the love, infatuation that you have with your new idea and make yourself push and step through.
Yeah. Let's put a pin in that one and we'll get into it. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. It's good. Yeah. The daily thinking walk was a huge one for him, which I'm amazed. I mean, we'll come back to that. The golden rule is number 5, and that is pay special attention to verifiable evidence that contradicts a dominant paradigm. Now, those are not his words. He wrote a whole page in his autobiography, dear listener, on the golden rule, and it's absolutely brilliant. And it is probably the most important one, I think, the golden rule.
Okay.
Very hard to do. Beware. You will find yourself in lots of very uncomfortable places. And the final one, which I know you deal with, is keeping a log of your decisions and why. And when you discover that you've made a bad decision, which of course we all do, I mean, we all make bad decisions, go back to it and try and understand why you made a bad decision. What could I have done differently? How did I come to that decision? And rather than, and so often, and I do it myself, when I find myself making mistakes, it's so easy to try and, paper it over, pretend it wasn't there. And Charles is very, very, really keen for us not to do that. So those are the 6.
Great. And then, of course, you've got to put all those things into practice in some way. We were talking just before we went live that behavior change is really important. And again, as someone who does a lot of advisory work and training, it's perhaps the hardest thing that people understand stuff intellectually, but then what, right? And so that's an interesting area to explore. Okay, wonderful. Let's dive into each of these and with a little bit more depth and where some of this is also coming from in terms of Charles Darwin's words. But the first one, data, not just feelings. Could we spend a little bit of time on that one?
Yeah, well, dear listener, have a think about, you're probably making 35,000 decisions today. How are you doing it? How are you doing it? Most of those decisions are habits. So there's no data and there's no feelings there. They're just simply habit. You get out of bed probably in the same way. You go and make a coffee in the same way. Those are all habits. Now, if you get into a series of bad habits, your life will not be good. If you reach for the bottle of whiskey in the morning as opposed to listening to Ben's podcast in the morning, things are going to go downhill. So looking at your habits is incredibly important and trying to get some data around this. Let me just first of all, I should imagine a lot of people know who Charles Darwin and Emma Darwin was. Charles Darwin was born in 1809. He was the son of a doctor, and he was nothing special as an individual, as a brain, but he went to Cambridge, of all ironic things, to become a creationist vicar. That is just spectacular. And while there, he studied, thankfully, a lot of the natural sciences because they believed they were studying God's creation. So they studied the natural sciences, which is fantastic. And the other thing that we can really thank Charles for is that they studied the classics. So they studied the ancient Greek thinking systems. And that's how he knew about inductive thinking, deductive thinking, and because he'd studied some philosophy in some of the classics. Emma Wedgwood, before she married Charles, was actually Charles's cousin, first cousin. And anybody who's done any genetics can probably go, what? He's going to marry his first cousin. This isn't going to turn out nicely. And sure enough, dear listener, this story does have some dark parts to it as a result of marrying his cousin. But of course, they didn't know anything about it in those days. It was absolutely common for you to marry close relatives. And it was a common thing for Cleopatra, for the pharaohs to marry their sisters and stuff. No one understood about genetics because it just didn't even exist. So Charles was at Cambridge. He was not a spectacular student. I think he came in the top 200 of his cohort. Nothing special. And then he got this. One of his lecturers said, "Would you like to go around the world on this naval frigate?" It was basically a glorified gap year. And Charles said, "Absolutely, I would love to do that." And so this was the sliding doors moment when he decided to go around the world. And this completely changed it all. He would have been the country vicar if he hadn't gone around the world. As you will see, dear listener, there's nothing like seeing something firsthand for really to change your view. Secondhand, not so impressive. So Captain Fitzroy, who was the third character in our story here, incredible individual as well, joined the Navy age 12, he got 100%. He was the first person to ever get 100% in the naval exam. At the age of 23, he was in charge of a 10-gun frigate, 74 men. Now, I don't know many 23-year-olds I'd give my car keys to, but this is a guy who is in charge of this ship at the age of 23. But there was a problem. The previous captain had shot himself due to depression because the captains always ate alone. And so the Captain Fitzroy, knowing that the captain would always be eating alone for maybe years, decided to bring a companion. And he also wanted to try and find evidence of the creation story. Here we are coming back to data here. So just to set the scene for you, you've got Charles, a theological student, leaving England. And when he comes back 5 years later, it was only supposed to be 2 years, but 5 years later, he is an entirely different animal as a result of seeing this data on the way around. So, I mean, dear listener, how do you use data? I mean, we all know how to use our feelings, but data is much harder to use because, of course, we can always be very selective with data. We can always handpick the data that lines up to our feelings. That's when you've really got to try and be quite tough on yourself and work out. Prioritize data is really important. That's what Charles did on the voyage. Work out which is the most important data, not which suits you the best data. Try and prioritize it and really use that.
Just a reaction to that. Sorry, Chris, just a reaction to that. I think one of the big things that is different from then versus now, and you mentioned that this is that we are drowning in data now. There's so much of it, and therefore, really being able to sort of frame the question that we're trying to answer, or the problem is very important, so that we don't just get. And I think this ties in with the other 5 aspects of the thinking system. We're not just cherry picking, as you say. It's an even harder thing to deal with now. There's just so much data available, and it's actually very easy also to ignore it because it's just there's too much of it. So I'll just go off and do what I've always done.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, not only is there so much data, but there's a lot of incorrect data as well. I mean, my son the other day, so how do we know the Earth is flat? Because I've looked it up on the web, and there is a website that says the Earth is flat. How do we know the Earth is round? So not only are we absolutely swamped with data, and the solution to that is try and prioritize the data, write it down on a bit of paper, go, which is the most important? I've got 10 bits of data. Which should be the most important for this decision that I'm thinking about making? The second thing is getting it from a good source, because there's a lot of rubbish data out there. So you're right. And Charles would have been in the reverse situation. But he was in the lovely situation, Ben, which is incredibly powerful. He was observing stuff himself. So he wasn't actually, he wasn't getting someone else's report. He was at the coalface observing it himself. Empirical data, which is incredibly powerful if you can get it. But a lot of the time we're not working with the original data. But yes. So yes. So what do you think? So Ben, do you use data?
I do use data, but one of the things that I emphasize quite a lot is something that I call decision framing, which is thinking through our decision against our purpose, our objectives, our values, and by doing that, it becomes a lot easier to understand what data you need versus what data you have, and that's how I tend to work with a number of my clients, because we have so much data. And in fact, some of the challenges that organizations tend to have, there are a lot of sources of data, and a lot of sometimes we have the problem flipped the other way around, in that we tend to look for meaning in the data, as opposed to try to figure out what data we want and need. And in organizations particularly, there's a laziness around thinking, because so much data is available. And in fact, vendors of software tools or whatever say, I can tell you these metrics and this and that, but that may not be the data you need. And often I find individuals and organizations answer questions that are easy to answer based on the availability of data, as opposed to starting from first principles. So it's a different take on the problem. Charles Darwin wouldn't have had this problem, but we do have it now.
We do, yeah. And it's really good. I mean, dear listener, when you're listening to somebody, try and listen for what is a data point and what is a feeling. Because often I sit in meetings and people are giving me, in inverted comma, data points, but actually they're just giving me feelings. They go, oh, look, I think that this is probably true. And you go, oh, I didn't like the sound of, I think this is probably true. Yeah. I didn't like that sound at all. That's not a data. That's just a sort of feeling about it. And, and we live in a world in which we think everything that we do is correct. And so I was keen to, through this podcast, bring in a paradigm, which is a modern paradigm, which is almost universally accepted. I mean, evolution is now widely accepted in the Western world, but it wasn't in Charles's day. But to get everybody feeling what it's like to have a paradigm being threatened, which is what Charles was doing, he was threatening a paradigm. Dear listener, I'd like to threaten one of your paradigms. I suspect you drink dairy. I'm guessing. I know, Ben, you don't, but because from our previous conversation, I was disappointed. Actually, I was hoping you would have drunk dairy, because it would have made it.
Right. Sometimes I do 1% of the time, and I do that when I have no option, I'm traveling or something like that. But otherwise, I try not to. Part of it because I have a plant-based diet. The other part is when I was growing up, I really had intolerance to dairy, and whenever I had a little bit too much of it, I'd get all stuffed up and I'd get like a cold, and so I've stayed away from it.
Yeah, it's remarkable. I mean, the number of people who have lactose intolerance is just huge. Dear listener, you probably have dairy, and I suspect you're probably going, what, this guy's going to now start challenging me about dairy? Dairy is natural, I suspect you're saying, dear listener. And you're probably also thinking dairy is essential, natural and essential. Now, when we're looking at data, if you were sitting there now, I suspect you go, I've got lots of data to prove that it is natural and essential. So those are two data points you probably feel pretty confident you can take to the bank. I'm going to try and undermine both of those, dear listener. Natural, 5,000 mammals in the world. Not one of them drink dairy all their lives. Not one. I mean, you can feed dairy to cats and it will drink it, but they don't seek it out in the wild. So, natural, you sure? Humans naturally eat dairy for 4 years at the very most. And then when we wean off our mother's milk, which is the natural process, we never drink dairy again as a natural thing. And so when I say that to people and you can see the cogs spinning in their head, they're going, wow, that's true. Of course you don't see, elephants drinking dairy or blue whales drinking dairy. And they go, that's interesting. I never thought of it in those terms because of course it is presented as being natural. Now let's have a look at the essential, dear listener, the essential fact. You probably think it's essential. You probably go, well, it's got really good calcium and it's in every single recommended, diet I've ever looked at. That dairy is a component of a recommended diet. Essential. Now, again, we go into the natural world and we have a look at essential and we see that if it was essential, then every single of those 5,000 mammals that don't drink dairy would all be having broken bones and be emaciated and dying and falling over and fractures and stuff. And yet none of them do. You never see a kind of elephant on the savannah sort of struggling along or a lion sort of legs breaking. So it is not essential or natural to have dairy. So now, the reason why I raise that, dear listener, is for you to see how you feel when I say that, because those are data points. How you feel is suppression of the unthinkable.
Yeah, it's interesting. We're not trying to convert listeners into becoming vegan or anything, but I think it's just a useful point when something that seems unthinkable is presented, there's a bit of a shock reaction. And I think we talk about behavioral change. And one of the things that is potentially useful is just to, that's interesting. I ought to look at that, right? As opposed to just, that if something just kind of, strikes you, I think that's a useful habit to get into. Not necessarily accept it as true, obviously, but rather than recoil and dismiss, you just say, "Oh, I wonder if there's something to that."
Yeah, and you look at business. I should imagine a lot of your clients are business people, and you see how some companies have incredibly successfully pivoted. I think Nokia made plastic boots or something before they started making mobile phones. In a fast changing world, in a disruptive world in which things change very quickly, you've got to be able to pivot and to be open to getting facts in which challenge your preconceptions.
Excellent. Let's move on to the second one. So intuitive, deductive,
the second,
inductive.
Yeah.
Yes.
So we got Charles. He's on the boat. He's going around the world. Captain Fitzroy has given him a little challenge. I want you to find evidence for the creation story. So that's his challenge. Luckily, Charles is equipped with intuitive thinking, which we all have. Everybody has that. But also he knew about deductive thinking. Dear listener, do you know what deductive thinking is? It's powerful. Aristotle, you may have heard of Aristotle. I'm sure you have. He came up with a deductive thinking. It is the basis of all the scientific method is deductive thinking. Do you know it, Ben? Do you want to have a shot at it? Explaining deductive thinking to the audience?
As far as I remember, I mean, it's when you have a premise, then you then take that premise and then you can say, oh, well, then therefore that must be or must not be true. And so you're thinking, sort of top down, here's a couple of facts, or here's a fact. Oh, here's another one. Oh, and then you can then deduce a conclusion or come to a conclusion based on that, as opposed to, and I could get this wrong, but in inductive would be more, you've got a bunch of data and you're kind of building upwards. So you've got these patterns of these things, and therefore it's telling me this. Is that more or less?
Yep.
Right.
More or less. Absolutely. So just, dear listener, it's quite complicated because the words are quite similar. Deductive is you make a hypothesis to start off with. Milk is good for me. That's my hypothesis. You then go and collect data to test your hypothesis, and then you come to a conclusion. Either if the data proves your hypothesis that milk is good for you, or if the data contradicts your hypothesis, you come to the conclusion that milk is not good for you. So that is deductive. And then Sir Francis Bacon came along and said, Aristotle's system's great. I think it's very useful, but I'm also going to turn it on its head, as Ben said. What we're going to do is we're not going to make a hypothesis. We're going to start off by going, what is the best thing to have in my cup of coffee in the morning? Is it milk, oat milk, soy milk, almond milk, or have it black? Let's just say those are our 5 options. You then, and you stop yourself coming to a conclusion. You then gather the data to put into a system to look at, well, what is the best type of milk to put in my coffee in the morning? And having looked at the data, you come to the conclusion on what that answer is. Now, when do you use deductive? When do you use inductive? If you've got a single question, then deductive is really great. If you've got a much more complicated question, which you're not really sure, you've got multiple ideas of what it could be, inductive is better. So Charles went around the world on this ship. He was supposed to be looking for evidence of the creation story. And he was thinking inductively because he really didn't know what he was looking at. He knew about Sir Francis Bacon, and he was inductively just sucking in all this data was just coming at him. He was in South America chasing rheas around there. He was climbing mountains. He was going to the Galapagos. It was like a sort of the once in a lifetime unbelievable trip. And he was just writing it all down and sucking all this data in. And then sitting in Australia, he shot a platypus. I'm sorry, dear listener, that's a lot of the naturalists in those days, they shot animals. He sat beside this platypus, this dead platypus. This is 5 years into his voyage. And he wrote down that it was the first time he challenged the creation story, that he looked at the platypus and he knew about the water rat from England. And he looked at both of them and he said, why would God make 2 animals so differently and put them both in the same ecosystem? They both eat invertebrates, live in water, and nest in banks. And the duck-billed platypus lays eggs. The rat, totally, really a very different animal. And so then he pivoted, and you can do this in companies. You can start looking at something inductively. That's going to be really good to start off with. He then went, wait a second, I'm going to come up with a hypothesis. I'm going to come up with a hypothesis that the creation story is wrong. That was then he pivoted to a deductive thinking mode, and he went, okay, let's go and gather the data. And it came out, it spat the information out. Yes, the creation story is wrong. And then he had to go, well, if the creation story is right, then how did life on Earth start? And so, and it is hard to get away from intuitive thinking, dear listener. I keep an Excel spreadsheet of every decision I make and which of those 3 systems I use. Do I use an intuitive system, a deductive system, an inductive system? And let me tell you, whenever I use the inductive system, by and large, absolutely 100% certain it was the right decision. Whenever I use intuitive, about 50-50. It's easy, it's quick. You don't want to make your big decisions in life on intuitively, is my recommendation.
That's very interesting. I just want to connect a couple of things here, because my last podcast episode was with Professor Joel Pearson, who teaches, actually he's a researcher in Sydney. So not far from where you are, Chris. And he studies the science of intuition. He's written a book about the science of intuition, and there's a lot to it. But one of the things that, so he talks about is, well, when to use intuition and when not. And when the environment is new and you don't really have experience, then you don't want to use intuition. And Charles Darwin was obviously in a very, very new environment. And so Professor Pearson tells the story of Steve Jobs, who made very intuitive decisions when it came to product launches and technological products, because that was his domain of expertise, and therefore his intuition was likely to be very powerful. But then when he got cancer, he used intuitive thinking to delay his surgery, which may have, actually cost him his life. He was using the same thinking system to a context in which it should not ever apply. So it's interesting when you say that, and you think about Charles Darwin, on this voyage, and obviously intuitive thinking would not have been very useful. So it's those three ways of thinking are obviously valuable, but it's a very instructive one about intuition, just because I've got that topic on my mind. And if he was an intuitive thinker, then we wouldn't have, the theory of evolution, or he wouldn't have been able to make sense of what he was seeing.
Yeah, I love that, Ben. That's really good. I mean, I love your point that you made there, that if it's an area you're very comfortable in, then intuitive thinking can be a nice,
very experienced. You're very experienced in.
Yeah, I think that's really nice. But if it's new to you, or I would like to add, Ben, if it's a significant decision, if it's who you're going to marry, if it's whether you're going to resign from your job, if it's what you're going to take a new job, or you're going to change professions.
Yes,
I would say, and that dovetails into what you're saying, because it's not, you don't get married every day of the week.
Well, exactly. Intuitive thinking for when you're getting married is pretty terrible, because it's something you don't want to do a lot. You don't want to have lots of experience in making that decision. You don't get very many shots at that.
Well, absolutely. But I don't know whether you're married, but I can tell you, when I got married, it was an entirely intuitive decision. It was prior to really getting, and I was incredibly fortunate. More luck than anything else. I mean, I was just really lucky that I met someone who was the love of my life, and it worked out really well. But it could have gone so badly wrong, because we actually, this actually leads quite nicely into the next topic that I know Charles would want me to talk about, which is Charles arrived back after 5 years going around the world with this unbelievable concept in his head. I mean, when he said it was like confessing to a murder, having this idea of evolution in his head. And he decided he decided he should start thinking about whether he should get married. And we've moved on to options now, which I love the fact you actually do it 3 to 6. Charles did this, and I never did this, but I remember when I looked, because he wrote it down, before he even got to who should I marry, he looked at the question, should I marry anybody? Which is so, incredibly analytic. And we still have the piece of paper, dear listener, when he did an analysis. On one column was marry, and the other column was not marry. And this incredibly rational thinker. I mean, that was obviously a deductive analysis, as in he was looking at a single question. He had his preposition, should I marry? And then he did his analysis. And at the bottom, he wrote QED, Quadet Darasandram. And yes, I marry, he wrote. And isn't that amazing? I obviously I tell my kids all the time, big decisions, don't use intuitive thinking. And he's incredibly lucky that Charles started meeting a whole lot of people, and he met his first cousin, Emma, who was also an incredibly deep thinker. She was a Wedgwood, so she was Wedgwood pottery. And this was not going to be a quick romance, but they absolutely got on like a house on fire. And it was one of the great decisions I like to think both of their lives, because they had such a beautiful relationship. And dear listener, if you want to have proof that Charles's decision-making skills can add value to your life, you just need to look at their life together, not just professionally, not just financially, but actually as having a wonderful relationship, how they managed to navigate that. And as you can see, as I've already alluded to, the fact they're cousins, there is going to be some sadness coming up. But they managed to navigate it. So the next one is the options. Try and think in terms of options. And we've spoken a little bit about it. And again, if you do intuitive thinking, if you want to go intuitive, I say to people, sure, go intuitive if you want to, but at least do the option analysis, because it'll stop you racing off too quickly. It'll force you to slow down that intuitive thinking and just try and get a few options lined up. So Ben, it sounds like you use options. Yes, this is all.
Yeah.
This is all.
And I'll throw in a few things, and this is great because we can, sort of riff back and forth. But on options, what I find challenging for people is to come up with a good set of distinct options that are viable, that are worth exploration. And what I find to get through that and around that is actually a little bit of creative thinking. That we sometimes we get in this sort of narrow either or thinking. Organizations do this a lot, an awful lot. When they make big investment decisions, big capital decisions, they have these sort of go, no go sessions. And the key question for me that I find unlocks a lot of stuff is there another way in which we could achieve this thing? And to start to think creatively about what those other ways might be. Sometimes you might start with some really absurd sounding ideas and you just try and work with them, but try and get to your set of 4. And that's inherently a very creative process. But then you actually can land on, say, four very viable options worthy of further exploration. And a little bit of creative thinking to come up with those options sometimes is actually very helpful.
Love it. Love it. I should imagine on occasion you're not very popular in the boardroom. I should imagine. There are moments where I go, "Oh God, who brought?"
Yeah, you're right. You're right. But I think the over time when you get through that, organizations get better outcomes. Get better outcomes because it can be uncomfortable. It can be very uncomfortable. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I mean, I've made decisions in my life and I've made professional decisions which have cost me years of my life going in the wrong direction.
Yes.
And you go, how on earth did I waste all that time? If I just spent 2 hours doing a decent analysis, I could have saved myself 2 years of going in the wrong direction, doing all the wrong stuff. And when you look at companies, I mean, millions of pounds or dollars was spent just because everybody's had a herd mentality. Somebody charismatic was sort of singing a nice song and cajoling everybody. And before you all know, everyone's charging off towards the cliff just because we all feel happy in the herd. Absolutely. It's remarkable. You see it, of course, all the time. It's, really hard to stop it.
It is. And I'll add another thing in here that I think sometimes we dislike conflict. Conflict can be very uncomfortable, but it's so important to have a little bit of friction. And there are ways of designing it so it's not about the person or the people, but just about the ideas. It's much better to talk about the ideas and their merits. And there are techniques that one can use to try to avoid. And one of the things that I think you talked about making a decision really quickly. I think consensus can be very dangerous. We're sometimes in a rush to all agree. And when we think about it, that actually could be a bad sign. And maybe we're adhering to the highest paid person in the room's opinion, for example, and we're not actually giving each option a full hearing. And I think designing a little bit of friction, particularly for the big decisions, just, well, wait a minute, what if we're wrong here? Or wait a minute, let's just think about that a little bit better. And sometimes one of the things I like to do, or to at least advise, is if you've got 4 options, give 4 different teams the task of analyzing them independently. So they don't have their job is to just do a thorough assessment of those 4 options. They don't have any they're not wedded to the out. They don't get a bonus if you go for one or the other. And then you come to I think a far better conclusion. Most organizations do not do that, but I think it's a powerful practice for these big multi-million or billion-dollar decisions. It's so, and it can be done quickly relative to, as you say, unwinding 2 years, spending 2 or more of trying to unwind a bad decision is not fun and very, very costly. So these are good.
Yeah. I like the idea about giving practice. It to, breaking the 4 options down, giving each option to one team, getting back. I think that's really clever way of doing it and just slowing the process down a little bit. Mm-hmm. And the other one that I like to do, whether you do this, Ben, is going, okay, so if you find yourself in a room where everybody else is jumped into is just about to jump off the cliff, they're all happy, the parachutes are all packed. You say, just before we do this, can we just write out the 10 data points that are the most relevant to this decision and what it is? Mm-hmm. Just slowing people down is really good. I think your system is great as well. So I think that's really, really good.
It does. Thank you. It doesn't work for every. We're talking about big material decisions here, right? So we shouldn't be doing it for what I should eat for breakfast. But I think if the decision is big enough, then it makes sense to do that. But let's move on to. I'm really excited about talking about daily thinking walks, which is the next one. But let's talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, well, look, I find this is the one that people do the least, actually. A lot of people like yourself who are well-read, and I think, dear listener, I suspect you've been listening to Ben's podcast. A lot of these concepts so far are probably not new. It's good to be reminded of them. But this next one is Charles and Emma reckon the most productive part of their day was their daily thinking walks. And Charles took this to a new level of sophistication. They lived in the south of England. He had this walk through this woodland. It was a circuit, and he used to leave 10 pebbles at the beginning of the walk. And depending on how big the issue was he was thinking about, he would pick up between 1 and 10 pebbles. A 10 pebble problem would mean 10 circuits around the woodland. And each time he went round, he would drop 1 pebble back onto the pile. And in theory, he could solve any problem within 10 circuits. Now, I don't know whether, Ben, you walk on a daily basis, even just 5 minutes a day. So you do that?
Yeah, I mean, I have a dog, so I have to walk the dog.
Oh, yes.
So it kind of forces me to do that. I do have contemplative practices, but it's not always a walk. I like to meditate, for example. I do exercise regularly. It's perhaps not as structured as the 10 pebbles. I really like that. Sometimes an insight will come to me when I'm riding my bike or doing something else. But I really like the idea of having a regular contemplative practice. And I like the structure of the pebble thing is really useful. I'm trying to figure out how I might be able to adapt something like that.
How you might also adapt that. Yeah. And to be honest, I struggle to do it every day. I managed to make up excuses in my mind why I don't have time. I did it today. Really liked it. And dear listener, just so you know, meditation, fantastic. But this is quite different, actually. Meditation is trying to empty your mind, to give you stress relief, all sorts of very, very strong positive benefits. But this is actually trying to fill your mind. This is concentrated, deep thought. And you'll find that your brain will, let's just say you're going off and you're thinking about taking a new job, let's just say, take as an example. You'll find yourself losing track. Your brain will come off track. Don't beat yourself up over it. It's absolutely normal, particularly when you start, to really struggle to hold on the thought of this new job. Try it. But it sounds like you're doing it already. I'm going to struggle to find something which you don't do, I think, Ben.
Well, I'm not as structured, and I do get into some habits that aren't, I work from home, so I'm in my office, I'm at my desk, and sometimes stuck over a problem or something, and if I take the dog for a walk or even just go and do a little bit of shopping or I don't know, something like that, sometimes it unlocks what I'm thinking about. And
look, I think it's incredible. I mean, and also what's fantastic, Ben and dear listener, is the number of great thinkers in history who used walking as a system for creativeness. Obviously, we all know about Newton, walking, going for a walk through a garden, sitting underneath an apple tree and being hit on the head. Well, I don't know if that story is true, but that's certainly a story. Bill Gates goes away for a week of thinking every year, and he takes a suitcase of books with him, and he goes off to this beautiful place that he tends to go to. I think it's got a view of a lake, and he views it as his contemplation time to really think about it. So many great thinkers, and of course, in religious world, you look at just about every single religious leader at some stage went off into the wilderness to go for these long sort of contemplative walks. So if you don't do that, dear listener, that is a really lovely one. And I tell you what, you will be blown away by how many good ideas. I had a great idea the other day, just going for a short walk. And I managed to put all the pieces together. And I went, wow, and I wouldn't have got it just sitting at my desk, typing away and doing emails and stuff. It's something about the walk. So yes, so that might be a really good one for you.
Yeah. And increasingly important, again, because we have so much stimulation. The other thing that I might do now that I'm thinking about this is actually go for walks without my headphones, without any stimulation, because we've got there's so much stuff. There's so much stimulation. We're overstimulated as well. And I don't think that's great. And I think I have a whole day, Ben. My Sunday is what I call a real world day, where I have I don't listen to podcasts. I don't watch any TV, no radio. I detox all day. And it's fantastic. Quite hard to start off with, because you're sort of constantly just reaching for something. I feel what do I do?
Awkward. I've got a stimulation. I'm not being efficient. I find myself thinking, I should be listening to something. Definitely don't. You can't listen to stuff on thinking walks. Charles wasn't reading a book as he walked around them. He was just deep thought, focused, deep thought.
I think that if I'm going to take a habit to change, is to put some type of digital detox into my world a little bit more.
Good for you.
So,
I think that's great.
That's I think a useful habit, useful practice. Very.
As you observed earlier on, there is so much information, but not a lot of processing of the information. We just have these headphones in, and we're just getting this bombardment of information, but we're not giving our brains the opportunity to actually sift through it and actually process it into something that makes sense. So I think that I'll tell me how you do, Ben. I'll be very pleased to hear how that goes. I suspect you'll find some great productivity actually.
I will. I'll start to implement that. So that's a really, really good one, a very useful reminder, especially certainly for me. And I think a lot of listeners who are sort of type A personalities, always feeling like we need to be productive all the time. So we could always be, I don't know, listening to an audio book or something while we're doing something else. And I'm maximizing the available time. But I think it's useful to pull ourselves out of that from time to time. Good stuff. So the next one's the golden rule.
Charles is working for 20 years on the origin of species. So he's working on this book for 20 years. And that's because he's getting data. He doesn't want to take anything for granted. He wants to do get the original data. He started breeding pigeons to see if he could actually make new species. Because at the time, people thought that was what the church was saying. You can't make new species because God created them all. So he spent 20 years doing this. And it wasn't all plain sailing because, he married his first cousin. So for those of you who understand genetics, of course, he had 10 children and they kept dying. 3 of them died. And I hope that none of the listeners sort of have experienced that firsthand. I certainly haven't, but I can imagine it. And I have heard one friend who's had a child die. I mean, horrific. Can you imagine the stress 3 children dying would have? And so he was going, what is going on? Why are all my children dying? And he started to wonder whether it was the fact that Emma was his first cousin. So he started to do what he called his golden rule. And if you don't do this, dear listener, ignore everything else we say. This is the one. This is the one. The golden rule, which I think I summarized it before, is pay special attention to verifiable evidence that contradicts your dominant paradigm. It is really hard to do. If you don't like Donald Trump, tuning in to Fox News and listening to Fox News talk about that would be very hard. If you don't like Kamala Harris, tuning in to CNN and listening to CNN talk positively about Kamala Harris is very hard. If you drink dairy, you probably found it pretty hard, me talking about how dairy is neither natural nor essential. But what that does, if you have the golden rule, whenever you find something which challenges your dominant paradigm, you will take a perky interest in it. You'll go, oh, wait a second, that is contradicting one of my dominant paradigms. Therefore, I should use Charles's golden rule and take an interest. Is it backed up with facts, verifiable evidence? Just because someone says the world's flat and you think it's round doesn't mean you should go, okay, I'm sure it's flat after all. You look at the evidence. And in business, this is essential because the new opportunity will almost certainly challenge your dominant paradigm. You are an ex-company. You are convinced that this is the right place to be. And when someone says, have you ever thought of doing Y? You would naturally go, no, we're an ex-company. But the golden rule forces you to take an interest in stuff that contradicts your dominant paradigm.
Yes, that's wonderful advice. It's a way of using. I mean, when you get that, that is generally speaking, an insight of potentially an insight. You're potentially onto a very powerful insight, and as we talk about it, I think it's worthy of further exploration. When something just doesn't quite make sense, paying attention to that is it's hard, right? We might want to explain that away, right? Oh, it doesn't. Oh, well, something's got to be wrong with that here, or that can't be right. Let's just we move on.
Absolutely, but dear listener, I mean, Ben is right. It'll be hard, particularly the first time you do it. You will be gritting your teeth when if whatever it is, you actually pay special attention. But after a bit, dear listener, it gets really fun because you're constantly thinking outside the box. You're constantly being creative. You're constantly going, oh, wow, that's interesting. I don't believe that. But wait a second, someone's given me some evidence which shows that that's wrong. And you're going, it becomes a really fun part of your life. And as a result of it, I mean, having used the golden rule over and over again for the last 20 years, I have changed so many aspects of my life as a result of that, and for the better. I mean, massively changed my life for the better. My life is enriched by that. That is the single best skill that Charles has to offer us through the ages. So good. So by the end of this, dear listener, I'm going to encourage you to adopt one of these skills, and I'm really going to try and get you to grab one, and not just go for 3 days, I'll do it, but actually incorporate it into your life, into your decision-making system, which I'm sure you've got if you're a regular listener.
Let's finish off we've got the last one, which is track decisions as a journal, which is great practice. You mentioned a spreadsheet. Yeah. I have a section in a book, actually, and I use a fountain pen as well, because I find I like fountain pens because it's cool. I love the way they feel, but also what I find when I use one is I slow down my thinking. So I write down now, like physically writing stuff down, and it's just a little bit harder to write clearly with a fountain pen. That's how I do it.
Maybe I should do that. That's interesting, because there is, dear listener, there he's challenged my dominant paradigm there. My dominant paradigm is the Excel spreadsheet is the best way. But now Ben has said, why don't you use a book? And I love your big red book, and I love the concept of the fountain pen, because there's almost a sort of ceremony associated with it. That it's like you're making decisions a ceremony, which I think is really powerful, rather than just tapping away at this keyboard. I think that's really lovely.
Now, it could be the other thing that I don't keep a decision journal for every decision. In fact, it's almost the opposite. When I start to ask myself, I'm an overthinker, by the way, Chris. I overthink everything. So when I do this practice, I dismiss a lot of decisions, because I realize, oh, well, this is one of those, we talked before, hats, haircuts, and tattoos. This is one of those hats or haircuts. I shouldn't be overthinking this. I should just make a decision and move on. And so, but it might be that a spreadsheet or something else should be something I use, or a way of combining them. Because after a while, I've got notebooks, behind me that I've used, and maybe there could be some merit. But anyway, let's just talk about tracking decisions in a journal a little bit more, because I think it's a powerful practice. And
I mean, Charles was of your opinion, the fountain pen and the book. And we pretty much can track his entire life, because he was such a prolific note taker and observer. And I mean, we're just so lucky that he was so keen on tracking his decisions and trying to understand them, and try to, work out the mistakes. And what am I doing wrong? And why am I doing that wrong? Why did I make that decision? So, I think, dear listener, if you don't do this, and I suspect there's probably some quite senior people listening to this, that is another really good one to have a think about. And the great thing about writing it down is it forces you to slow it down. You have to open up the spreadsheet or open up the book. You have to go, well, what data point did I use for this decision? What system did I use? Intuitive, deductive, inductive. Did I use the options? What were the options? And then you can come back to it a few years later. And it's often a bit of a rough moment when I do come back and look at my old decisions. And I go, oh, that was a bad one. I shouldn't have done that. God, and I made some terrible decisions in my life. Particularly before I started really getting to know Charles's system. So yeah, dear listener, we're there. We're at number 6. I mean, I hope, dear listener, you've sort of listened to some of this and you've got something new. And we're just going to finish off by giving you, because so often, because you've probably got your headphones in a lot, everyone's giving you their five tips, and it's really hard to actually implement them. So I was keen just to finish off, and I should imagine a lot of people know about behavioral change and how to get habits to stick, just to go into a few absolutely dead cert ways. If you have heard something which you'd like to implement, how to implement it so that it doesn't just last 3 days like those New Year's resolutions do.
Yeah, let's get into some of that. Which is we were talking before. I struggle with this sometimes. I know I struggle to help clients sometimes, that it's easy to understand a lot of what we're talking about. It might make intellectual sense, but then applying it is often the hard part. And so these are practices, and I'd be keen to hear a little bit more about behavior change and, well, what Charles Darwin could teach us, and what, how you help people to make some of this stuff stick.
Yeah. Well, let's go through. I mean, let's say, for an example, to be provocative, let's just say the dear listener, you've decided to have 1 cup of coffee a day with soy milk in, not dairy. Let's just say that is our theme. How would you make sure that sticks? So the first, I'm not really using Charles Darwin here. I'm much more using 2 really great writers, B.J. Fogg from Stanford University, who wrote the great book Tiny Habits, and James Clear, who wrote a great book called Atomic Habits. And when he said atomic habits, he meant very, very small. He wasn't meaning bombs and stuff. It was just atomic, really small habits. So I picked out 6, which I use all the time, systems. And I am able to pretty much, I've given up alcohol, flying, going in petrol cars. I've given up my temper. I'm at the moment, trying to get a knee better. It's recovering because I'm doing my physiotherapist's exercises. So I have just had so much fun with using the system. The first thing is decide on your ultimate goal. Let's just say your ultimate goal is you want to have 1 cup of coffee a day with soy milk in. And then you've got to find out why. So it's the ultimate goal and why. Am I doing it just because that guy, Chris Darwin, banged on about it? That's not a good reason. That is a reason which won't stick. You've got to have a good reason. Your why is really important. The ultimate goal and the why is the first thing. If you can't write that down in a clear way, there's probably something wrong. The second one is implied in the B.J. Fogg system and the Atomic Habits system. And it's not essential, but I think it's pretty good. Keep it as small as possible. If you say, I'm going to give up dairy as of today, I'm never going to have dairy again, I will give you 4 days before you break. If you say, I'm going to have 1 cup of coffee a day with soy milk in, I think there's a really good chance that'll stick. So making it small, making it tiny. The third thing is try and only change 1 habit at a time. So let's just say you decide to do Charles Darwin's walking system. Don't do the coffee and the walking system at the same time. Do one or the other, because it is hard. We are a creature of habit. We have to rewire our brains effectively to get a new habit in. The wiring is already there. You've got to rewire it. So it is hard to change habits. So that's the one habit at a time. Now, there are a few things you have to do. The one you have to do is, there are only 2 that you have to do. And that is a reminder, setting yourself up a reminder. That is, whether you look at B.J. Fogg or you look at James Clear, they all say you've got to have a reminder. If you're going to go for a thinking walk every day, you have got to put in a reminder into your phone so you go for a walk. If you're going to have a cup of coffee with soy milk in, you've got to remind yourself. You've got to put an alarm. You know you have your coffee at 8 o'clock. Put in the alarm at 7:30 to remind yourself. So that's the reminder is essential. Then this is the other one that you have to do. There's only 2 of these 6 you have to do. You have to track. If you don't track, if you don't measure, you cannot manage. If you don't track it, you will never know what's going on. So I track it all. So, for example, I'm at the moment I'm a climber, and so my knee is really important to me. I have to have great knees to be able to do speed climbing. So I've got a bad knee at the moment. So I track that I do my exercises for my knee 3 times a day. I have a spreadsheet. I put in a green bar to reward myself when I've done it, and I do my exercises 3 times a day. If I miss it out on one day, I don't fall off the bus and give up and go, oh, it's all too hard. I just put a red bar in there, and I just get back on the horse the next day. And the final thing in the system, which again BJ Fogg and James Clear say, is celebrate. Once you've done whatever it is you want to do, you've had your coffee with soy milk, it can just be a little yay, or it could be a pat on the back, or it could be just smile, anything. But you've got to do it immediately after the behavior you're trying to change. Immediately after. So if you're going for your walk, your thinking walk, immediately after it, give yourself something which you love. I don't know what that is, but make sure you really love it. And those are the 6. So dear listener, I hope that's been helpful. I mean, I know it will be, actually, because I bet you, if you listen to these podcasts, you probably are on a journey of self-improvement. And so I'm pretty confident it'll happen.
This is great. I really value all of this stuff, and just the message about keeping it small, I think, is actually quite powerful. Also, because and you talk about New Year's resolutions and things like this, we make these grandiose promises to ourselves, and then whenever there's a little setback, we say, "Oh, well, that was too hard," right? Whereas if you start the other way, they sort of build and it compounds, and you create a foundation, and it's easier to do the next thing. And so I really like it.
Absolutely. There's nothing more addictive than success.
Mm-hmm.
Having lots of successful small changes is much better than going for they're used to that whole thing of go hard or go home. Yeah. Absolutely the wrong approach. Go small. Have a success.
Yeah. The people who say, go hard or go home, or go big or go home, they, what ends up happening is they end up going home, right? So they don't stick to it, right? So
that's so true.
Yeah. This is great. Chris, we covered obviously a lot of ground here. Was there anything that you wanted to mention that you don't think we got enough time to adequately cover?
Okay, that's a nice wrap up. I don't think so. Dear listener, have a lovely life. Make yourself a lovely life. Doesn't matter what your current circumstances are. And I've had some bad situations, but you can come out of it. If you're listening to this podcast because you're in a bit of a tricky time now, don't worry. Just make good decisions, and you will find your life will become really special. So, for those of you who are doing really well, keep it up. We've got a really amazing challenge ahead of us in the next couple of decades. There's a lot of stuff which we need to do in our civilization. So contribute towards that. And I've really enjoyed this, Ben. Love to all, I think, is really love yourself, love others, and love the planet is my final thought.
I love it. That's great. Chris, thank you so much. Really appreciate this. And for those who have listened to this and have enjoyed it and want to know more about you and your work and how to follow you or maybe get in touch or anything like that, what are the best ways to do that?
Yeah, so I work for a charity called the Darwin Challenge. We have a contact us page. Anybody who wants to get in contact with me, I'm always keen to hear from everybody. I don't do social media so much, although the Darwin Challenge does, but I don't personally do it very much. I'm on LinkedIn, but you get so many random requests on LinkedIn that I don't really watch it very much. So, but yeah, the Darwin Challenge, .org is the name of the charity, and happy to hear from you. Yeah, it'd be interesting.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Chris. I really appreciate this, and I really enjoyed it.
My pleasure, Ben. I've really enjoyed it too. I've really enjoyed it. It's great. So I'll be listening to your podcast, Ben. Listening more, because I've already listened to quite a lot. It's great. Yeah, really. We need more of it.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Chris.